Dobry день, this is Anton, and you're watching Foreign Antoons. It all started with our first animation history video in 2020, the history of Russian animation. Then we covered French animation, followed by the Italian, German, British, and Spanish animation vids respectively. But this time we are near the point where we started all those years ago, in the Slavic country of Ukraine. Unless you've been living off the grid, you've heard about the infamous war that rages on in Ukraine for years now, and with whom some of you unaware may ask. Why, that's with none other than the vodka bear Mother Russia, of course, animation of which we have now learned about. So it is now Ukraine's turn to take the spotlight. Now before we begin, a disclaimer. I just want to state that like most of the world, I'm against this blood sport, and being of mostly Ukrainian blood myself, as you may have already known thanks to one video of mine, it is especially painful for me to witness all of this terror in the news. I may have only spent a few years in Ukraine while growing up, and before being taken away to Estonia, it is still dear to me, and most of my relatives still live there. It is also a very complex situation for me, as I grew up in Russian-speaking communities in Estonia after the Soviet Union collapsed in the early 90s. So Russian culture is very close to me, more than the Estonian one in fact. This is why it feels like two parts of me are at war with each other every time I watch the news. But anyways, this video isn't about me, so let's carry on. At first, we'll go over the origins of Ukraine in the fastest way possible, so you can get a better idea of what this country is about, before we go to the animation parts, that is. But if you don't care about this pure history stuff, you can skip straight to animation on this timestamp. So anyway, let's start. Ukraine was the center of the first Eastern Slavic state, Kievan Rus, which during the 10th and 11th centuries was the largest and most powerful state in Europe. Weakened by violent quarrels and Mongol invasions, Kievan Rus was incorporated into the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and eventually into the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The cultural and religious legacy of Kievan Rus laid the foundation for Ukrainian nationalism through subsequent centuries. A new Ukrainian state, the Cossack Hetmanate, was established during the mid-17th century after an uprising against the Poles. Despite continuous pressure from Moscow, the Hetmanate managed to remain autonomous for well over 100 years. By the way, Cossacks will later play a big role in the world of Ukrainian animation, so this is important. And for those who don't know what a Cossack is, the word comes from the Turkish kuzak, which means adventurer or free man. There's a haze of romance surrounding these tough warriors who can ride horses like the best. They lived quite isolated in the southern steppe region of Eastern Europe, Ukraine, and the Asian part of Russia. Through their lives in the middle of nowhere, they have developed their own culture and tradition that express themselves in a certain way of life, their own songs, clothing, etc. During the latter part of the 18th century, most Ukrainian ethnographic territory was absorbed by the Russian Empire. Following the collapse of Tsarist Russia in 1917, Ukraine was able to achieve a short-lived period of independence until 1920, but was reconquered and forced to endure a brutal Soviet rule that engineered two forced famines in which over 8 million people died. In World War II, German and Soviet armies were responsible for some 7 to 8 million more deaths. Although final independence for Ukraine was achieved in 1991 with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, democracy and prosperity remained elusive as the legacy of state control and endemic corruption stalled efforts at economic reform, privatization, and civil liberties. There's a bit more history, but let's save it for later, as it does tie into the animation as well. For now, I want to briefly mention why this country is special to me. And yes, I already said that
this video isn't about me.
And it's still not. I just think this is a good chance to talk about my connection to the whole situation because of my background. So I was born in Estonia, but both of my parents have immigrated from Ukraine, and I spent some brief time between Estonia and Ukraine during my childhood years. I also still try to speak to my family and relatives in Ukrainian, despite never really studying the language at school or even on my own. I just picked it up orally, but because I'm away from the land of Ukraine most of my life now, I only know very basic Ukrainian. Most of the words I end up borrowing from Russian language, which is widely spoken in the Estonian capital where I live. Since Ukrainians all had to learn Russian during the Soviet Union, they usually understand what I say in my fused Russo-Ukrainian tongue. This Russia and Ukraine connection is saddening to think about when you consider the Russian-Ukrainian war. The reason why I bring this up is because some of the animation reflects that history between Russia and Ukraine. Animation, like any art form, can touch upon real-world topics. This includes politics and culture. So now that we've learned what's going on, let's dive into the weird and the surreal world of Ukrainian animation. So Ukraine's first known project for animation was The Tale of the Strawball. The animated short was created by Vyacheslav Lewandowski of the All-Ukrainian Photo Cinema Administration in Odessa. It was based on a fairy tale by Alexander Oles. This film is unfortunately lost, but one person by the name of Alexander Shimon described some of the film. Shimon stated, "We saw several cartoon characters, small paper figures of animals consisting of hinged parts. They still amaze us with their expressiveness and filigree and how they perfectly reproduce the illusion of movement." The tale of the straw bull was more than likely destroyed not only by World War II, but also the Holodomor, which was a great famine that took place within Soviet Ukraine due to Stalin's policies. In 2017, as a celebration of the 90 years of Ukraine's animation, a group was started by journalist and animation enthusiast Ivan Kapitonov. The group initiated 90 years of Ukrainian animation, and the goal here was to animate scenes using their own techniques in order to revive the lost short. But moving back to the early years, the other animated shorts made in Odessa and Kiev at the time were mainly propaganda pieces, such as Dnieperstan, Safe Paper, the USSR Palace of Art, and Prodany Appetit, or Sold Appetite. Dnieperstan depicts a plan to start a revolution by mining for resources and creating power plants and dams to harness new energy. This creates the titular area called Dnieperstan. The dams will also flood certain areas when blocking off the Dnieper River. Safe Paper involves all these papers and letters being given to this one man to pack up and store into a room along with other papers. The USSR Palace of Art depicts various types of anthropomorphic representations of different art. Examples include pianos for music and cameras for videography. They all go into a building that crumbles to dust, and then a newer building is built in its place. Prodany Appetit or Sold Appetite depicts a cutout style where an overweight man eats a variety of foods, even live animals. However, even these propaganda shorts were stopped by the Holodomor. It wasn't until 6 years later that a group of young animators who also happened to be in Odessa put together their own animated short, Murzilka in Africa. It is about the titular Murzilka and his nerdy-looking friend who goes to Africa in order to save a black child from cruelty and captivity. It is mostly cartoony animation with some slight choppiness in places. The one scene in particular was clearly rotoscoped. I will say this about the short, compared to other black characters being depicted at the time. The designs of the black characters here seem relatively normal. A year later, two of Vyacheslav Lewandowski's students, Semyon Guotsky and Eugene Gorbach, created their own animated short. This short was called Tuk Tuk and his friend Juk. It is about the adventures of a titular boy and his dog. The short features images like dancing flowers, working bugs, and marching mice. It also features a fox holding a cross in one sequence. This was intended to be the start of an ongoing series of shorts. However, because of the ongoing war as well as oppression, the focus was much less on animation, and so the art form diminished its output for a while. Animation did not rise back up into prominence in Ukraine until the 1950s, when Irina Gurvich, Nina Vasilenko, and Ippolit Lazarchuk started to make their own animated productions. This was happening within the studio by the name of Kiev Nauchfilm, or Kiev Studio of Popular Science Films. Kiev Nauchfilm initially started as a studio known for their science films. Eventually they became more recognized for their animated works. It became the second largest animation studio for the Soviet animation, right after Russia's Soyuz Multfilm. While some of the people from the earlier days of animation came to work for Kiev Nauchfilm, many of the other people employed as animators, such as David Cherkassky, were not animators. Rather, they were trained as architects. The idea was to train a new generation with fresh new ideas, different from what has already been experimented with before. Earlier efforts, such as the Mayfairy, tried to play it safe when first starting out. The Mayfairy, also known as Spring Song and the Caddis Fly, has a style reminiscent of many of the works created by Soyuz Multfilm. In 1961, the film titled The Adventures of Pepper was created and released by people who were actually beginners in animation. The film involves the titular magazine employee, Pepper, who helps out animals with problems such as pollution and poachers. The company got more experimental with shorts like Vasilenko's Marusia Bohuslavka, which was based on a traditional ballad. In 1967, the Ukrainian film studio Kiev Nauchfilm received a letter by an anonymous person from Zaporizhia. The person pitched an idea to the studio that was titled How the Cossacks Cooked Kulish. The film ended up being created and was quite a zany animated short. The Cossacks became successful enough that the idea was reimagined as a cartoon series. This series, known as The Cossacks, became a huge hit in Ukraine. The animators were given 3 designs for the characters, a big one named Tur, a small one named Oko, and a thin one named Grai, whose design came from a drawing of a long stick. The series ended up with 10 cartoons in total, featuring the Cossacks on different adventures. Besides cooked kulish, there was also how Cossacks searched for happiness, how the Cossacks played football, how the Cossacks rescued the brides, how the Cossacks bought the salt, how the Cossacks became Olympians, how the Cossacks helped the musketeers, how the Cossacks played hockey, how the Cossacks enjoyed the wedding, and how the Cossacks met the aliens. All of these films were developed by Vladimir Dakhno, who is a veteran at Kyiv Nauchfilm and originally studied as a medic and then an engineer. Dakhno's work has been awarded greatly, as he has received the Shevchenko National Prize of Ukraine and the People's Artist of Ukraine. He passed away in 2006, but 7 years later, on his 81st birthday, Google actually released a doodle in Dakhno's memory featuring the Cossacks. The Cossacks eventually received a revival in 2016. It was then, starting at the late 60s through the 70s and 80s, that Kyiv Nauchfilm had their golden age period, and during that time they were experimenting with many themes, graphic designs and techniques. The studio became the most stylistically diverse workshop for animation in the Soviet Union. The people of Kyiv Nauchfilm continued their creative endeavors with works like The Little Bear and The One Who Lives in the River, Man Who Could Fly, How Wives Sold Their Husbands, Adventures of Captain Rongel, A Checked Chicken, The Young Crane, Bunny Got Lost, White Arena, About the Big and the Small, Wonders, Savushkin Who Did Not Believe in Miracles, Kapitoshka and their own take on Alice in Wonderland, and Alice Through the Looking Glass. The mini-series Adventures of Captain Rongel, which became one of the most well-known cartoons of the Soviet Union, involves the titular sea captain who often competes in a regatta. A regatta is basically a boat race, if you don't know. The boat race is actually linked to a theft that occurred in a famous museum. One of the notable things about this mini-series is that it does not stay within one animation style. At some points, the characters will be animated in the traditional cell animation. At other points, the series would instead be animated paper cutout stop-motion style. What is also notable about this series is that live-action footage is used instead of animating the backgrounds. This was considered avant-garde for animation at the time and garnered a sizable audience almost for that reason. There were certainly some other intriguing shorts. The one titled Bunny Got Lost has a more cutesy style, while still distinctly European. I also must say the main rabbit character reminds me a lot of the early bunny design that almost became Sonic. Some of these shorts have more of a UPA look, like The Little Bear and The One Who Lives in the River and The Man Who Could Fly. Others are much more unique in their animation style, though one could still guess it came from Ukraine, like Wonders and Savushkin Who Did Not Believe in Miracles. Another notable animated short is Kapitoshka. Kapitoshka is a story about relations, showing how a wolf interacts with a living bubble, which is called Kapitoshka. At first, the wolf tried to capture the bubble. Later, however, the bubble made the wolf laugh and they became friends. This short was well received enough that it eventually received a sequel a few years later. Here, the little wolf's aunt comes to visit and she tries to capture the bubble herself. What Kyiv Nauchfilm might be most well known for in international markets was of course the adaptations of Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland and Alice Through the Looking Glass. These films were notable for being just as mad as one would expect with stories based on Wonderland and Looking Glass. The design for Alice was odd enough that the higher-ups took issue with how the characters looked.
Замочная скважина была слишком велика, то ли ключик слишком мал. Открыть эту дверь ей не удалось. К величайшей радости Алисы ключ к этой двери подошел. Ах, как ей захотелось выбраться отсюда.
One other thing the movies are notable for is that they change styles within the movies themselves, similar to Adventures of Captain Wrangel. The Ukrainian Alice movies constantly switch between different animation techniques, including stop motion and cell animation, and they even featured footage of live recordings. Many of Kyiv Nauch Film's shorts were adaptations of old stories or books. Basically, Kyiv Nauch Film helped to unify its Ukrainian students through the likes of folklore and literature. Ukraine as a whole became the heart of Soviet cartoons. David Cherkassky trained Russian animators like Igor Kovalyov and Alexander Tatarsky on animation, and they both became quite accomplished in their own right. Kyiv Nauch Film in particular stood out by being able to create a number of shorts with a variety of styles, not to mention philosophies and tones. A more mind-bending work like Laziness could exist with an atmospheric short like The Meeting. A short like White Arena can be put together using a stop-motion technique with folded paper. A cell-animated project like The Death of a Government Clerk can be modeled with a super-shaded look. Something similar was experimented with the movie Klaus decades later. Even projects like We Are Woman have so much going for it, like its use of paintings and the various moving camera angles. These techniques make that particular project such a marvel to watch. The studio continued releasing projects. They released a short film in 1984 called How Petrik Pyatachkin Counted Little Elephants, which was written by children's writer Natalia Guzeeva. It is about a boy who has a dream about small colorful elephants. And now we get to my personal favorite film in this entire video, David Cherkassky's Treasure Island. It still holds up pretty well after over 30 years, and you can watch the full English subbed version here on YouTube, before somebody takes it down that is. The unique character designs, the gags, and overall atmosphere in this movie is unlike any other Treasure Island adaptation I've seen, and there's a lot of them out there. Sure, the transition between animation styles and techniques, like in the aforementioned Alice in Wonderland movie, may not be for everyone. But just for the traditionally hand-drawn segments alone, it's worth the watch. It became one of the most beloved animated properties in Slavic countries, and memes even emerged from it in recent years. Of course, the one most people now know is the walk. Probably the meme that made nearly everyone aware of this movie's existence. These designs also remind me a lot of Wario. A part of me wonders if someone got inspired by the designs in this project when creating the infamous Nintendo character. Not only that, but the whole pirate theme seems rather similar to Wario's first game as the main protagonist. In Wario Land Super Mario Land 3, you got the treasure theme, the island, the pirates. I just have a feeling some of the designers from Nintendo saw this version of Treasure Island and maybe got inspired by it, but maybe it's just a coincidence. By the time Treasure Island was being made, the Soviet Union was beginning to fall. In the 1990s, when the Soviet Union fell, many of the archives related to the Soviet Union and Kyiv Nauch Film were destroyed. For the most part, shots and scripts were all that remained of the Soviet history of animation in Ukraine. Even with that event, Kyiv Nauch Film continued to make more projects to this day. In fact, some would say because of the fall of the Soviet Union, this allowed more freedom and creativity to be explored by animators, old and new. Some examples of Kyiv Nauch Film's new projects include Captain Tusi, The Tale of the Goddess Makosha, and The Insolent Goat in the 90s. The tram was going number 9, Save and Keep, and Snow Will Cover the Tracks in the 2000s, and Victor Robot, Papier-Mâché, and Unnecessary Things in the most recent years. In the 90s, while Kyiv Nauch Film still technically existed, they changed their name to National Cinematheque of Ukraine, and their animation division became Ukranima Film. In 1991, the movie Eneida was created by Cossacks developer Volodymyr Dakhno. The animated film is based on a mock heroic poem of the same name, which was considered to be the first literary work that was written fully in the modern Ukrainian language.
Карфаген. Розумна пані і моторна. Для неї трохи сих імен. Бідняшка, що була вдова.
In 1994, Ukranima Film joined with Arrival, the first non-government for-profit animation studio in Ukraine, Boris Fenlutes. To go into some of the projects Kyiv Nauch Film, or rather Ukranima Film, has done, it could be said that the studio's creativity has gone extreme and wild. The short Captain Tusi is animated unlike anything seen before. It would be hard to categorize the style of animation for the short. The Insolent Goat by Irina Smirnova had a different look of painted animation compared to other projects released at the time.
Сини, а кози не було. Поїхав дід на ярмарок і купив таки козу.
During this fall of the Soviet Union and the apparent rise for Ukrainian animation, the Krok International Animated Film Festival, which was initially held in Russia in the even years and in Ukraine in the odd years, was truly held internationally for the first time in 1991. However, during the 90s, Ukrainima Film ran into problems with financing due to the government going into reduction and therefore no longer having the funding for the studio to make more projects. Ukrainima Film's offices were becoming vacant, and many of the best animators the studio had went to work in other countries like France, Russia, or America. However, even with that hardship, Ukrainian animation still pressed on and found its way to survive. Ukrainima Film still created their animated projects, of course. In the 2000s, the studio made a different style of animation for Save and Keep. The powder-based Snow Will Cover the Tracks, and the claymation short The Tram Was Going Number 9. As Ukrainima Film went along as best as they could, more independent studios started to come into being, such as Novator Film. Novator Film in particular was specializing in animation made through the technique of claymation. These independent studios have taken more importance in keeping animation alive in Ukraine. Novator Film produced a series that became quite popular in Ukraine. That series was the early 2010s My Country Ukraine. One other studio that received notable attention was the Kyiv-based Animagrad, which was part of the Film.ua group. Animagrad got a box office hit in the country with 2018's The Stolen Princess, which was a project backed and funded by the government.
One day, she literally just ran into me.
Please, call the guards. Or a knight, perhaps.
So I had no other option but to say, Sir Ruslan, at your service.
This studio also produced projects for television, such as Fairy Rus and Our Football. The struggle for animation in Ukraine was a long and for some strenuous process. The result of that hardship now is that the Ukrainian animation industry is finally returning to prominence, with some help from public funding. In the 2010s, the government funding had also begun to be used to help produce the animated films in Ukraine again. There are now more than 30 different animated films being produced in Ukraine. Victor Robot by Ukrainima Film is a recent example of how big Ukrainian animation has gotten. It took a long time in production and finally got released to acclaim and success.
Не бійся. Мене звати Віка. А тебе? Віктор.
Ukrainima Film has also begun to work on television shows, which includes The Adventures of Kotigoroshko and His Friends, a show that is based upon Ukrainian heroes, legends and myths. In 2014, Ukrainima Film released Babai, which was their first feature-length animated film to go public. It was not a success, but now the door was open to release more of their films outside of their country. The next film opening to much bigger success was their first 3D animated feature. It was based on the tale Nikita the Tanner, and it was titled The Dragon Spell.
Our world is in grave danger.
I want to be a hero like you.
Son.
Ukraine's next 3D film was The Stolen Princess. The movie is based on the fairy tale Ruslan and Lyudmila by the Russian poet Alexander Pushkin. Ukrainian animation studios had also made projects using the motion capture technique, although that wasn't used as much as Ukraine did not have the technology for some time. If a studio from Ukraine really needed it, they might enlist the help from another country to get the animation necessary for the production. If a studio does have the capabilities to create 3D animation like Digital Cinema Ukraine, it would be a separate division from the 2D one of the same studio. The money is being given to Ukraine for animated projects. The country still does not receive as much as other nations. Many of the animators from Ukraine still get hired to go to other countries, and that includes Russia. Though Ukraine never particularly got quite as popular as Soyuz Multfilm, the country still had its share of memorable and notable projects. As we speak, with the support of the Ukrainian Animation Association and the country's government, Ukraine's most recent film is Mavka, The Forest Song. Now, of course, as mentioned earlier in this video, Russia is still attempting to invade Ukraine. Animation producer Olga Zurzenko had to flee to Odessa, though it hasn't quite stopped her animation work. It is said that the Ukrainian spirit is indomitable, and that can be also true for its animators. Ukraine's animation has a long enough history and quite a number of projects to check out. If the support continues to grow in Ukraine, the future is looking pretty good. Oh, and if you like this history stuff, I made a playlist with all the other animation history videos we've made so far, so you can have it all in one place to explore. So this has been Anton, and you've been watching Foreign Antoons. До побачення!